Hey Bashers, welcome to RC Shocks 101 Part 2, and in this video we're going to go over the silicone that we use, and it's this one. And this is nitro fuel tubing for a 10th scale RC, and that's what this is. And we use plenty of this. The 10th scale stuff we use in our 10th scale cars because everything is smaller, but they have a larger fuel tubing for the airplanes and for the 8th scale stuff, and that we use on most of our 8th scale things. And in this video we're going to go over why we use it, where we use it, and what are the special applications and the benefits of having this in there. This should be fairly informative. Check this out. Alright, so if you haven't seen RC Shocks 101, I recommend that you go back, and that'll be right up here, I think. That link will be right there for you, and you can go check that out first and then come back to this one, because in that one we showed you how to build this. And this is a aftermarket shock, but it's built much like all of the other ones as far as what the components are and all this. This is an actual Sen Racing Reaper shock absorber, and it's a much larger barrel on it, but not as long. Still, at the same time, this has its issues and can be dealt with. This one we used since it was dry. It's been filled with fluid and used since then, but this one was dry, so we tore it all apart, showed you what was involved in that, and that's in the other video. In this one, we're going to take off where we left off there and show you why and the benefits of having this in there. And this was all spurred up by a comment that we had from a viewer, and his was, why use the silicone tubing? Because you can only get half of the distance of travel when the silicone compresses, and it shortens the travel of the shock absorber, and it doesn't work the way we think it does, basically. Now I'm paraphrasing because I read this a couple days ago, but the idea was that adding the silicone shouldn't be done, at least in that opinion, because it doesn't allow for full travel of the shock absorber. Now, what you have to understand is there are a couple of different reasons you use stuff like this, and we have at least 3 reasons that we use it. And the first one is a bump stop, and that's what it is. So we've got a piece in here, and I'll get you a close-up of this, but there's a piece in there and it's about 1/4 of an inch long. And when the shock bottoms out, and this one, just so you know, this one's been shortened. It is the same shock absorber, it is, but there's a 3/4 inch piece of silicone on the inside of this one to change the distance on it. So if you want to lower your RC, there's a way to do that. And we covered that in the other video, but we'll touch on it here too. So let's start right with this one. This is your silicone sleeve, and when this compresses, and we'll go ahead and push it down, that's where it would stop, okay, with the silicone. But when you hit hard enough and you just get a little more grip on it, you can squeeze it and it goes clear to the metal stop. That silicone tubing gets out of the way and it goes all the way till the stop. Listen. It still hits the end stop, so the silicone tubing will deform and get out of the way. It'll still allow it to bottom 100% of the way out. But here's the advantage to this. When this is on the car and an arm takes an impact, it puts all of the energy onto this. Now, when the spring takes it up, the spring is ride height and resistance. Yes, the oil is also resistance, but you may not have a thick enough oil in there to take the impact, but it's the right oil for handling. So there's 2 different things in there, because you need a certain level of fluid in there for handling, but that doesn't mean it'll take a dive and really absorb that well, because you can't set it up to do both unless you're racing in really hardcore conditions. If you're running on a track and taking small jumps, your impacts are minuscule compared to what they are if you come down off of something. That's where this comes into play. So what it is this piece of silicone in here works like an extra spring for that. And what it does is when the shock compresses and it gets down to that silicone piece, instead of hitting hard, this is what it sounds like without the silicone. It hits hard and it transfers all of the energy from A to B straight into the arms, which is harder on the hinge pins, it's harder on the components of the swing arms, it's harder to the connection points for the shock as well, because instead of having a smooth stop, it transfers a sudden stop into everything else, and it creates more vibration, and it creates a little more impact to the components. The idea of having the silicone in there is it works like a secondary shock absorber. It hits the rubber slows it down, and you don't get that sudden stop at the end. with enough impact, it will still get 100% compaction on that. Like I said, you can squeeze it down, and I'm not pushing all that hard, and I'm all the way to the stop. The silicone is not in the way. It moves because it's just fuel tubing. It's not hard silicone. It's the soft stuff they use for fuel line. So that is what we use that for. That is the bump stop, and that prevents damage to the other parts. And let's talk about the second part of that, and that is actually adjusting ride height the other way. Now, some cars, like the Sen Racing Reaper, have problems with compressing too far. And if you take a look, the Reaper does not go all the way to the ground. Check this out. The chassis stops short of the ground, which maxes out the shocks. Now, the problem is these shocks have a rubber stopper in them, and that prevents them from traveling too far, or it spits the drive lines out. And this seems to be a manufacturer's error as far as how big the shocks are, how far they'll travel, and what the actual suspension will allow, and all the parts hanging together. So as a stopgap measure, they put a hard piece of rubber in there, much stronger than what we use, and it's supposed to stop the car from going too far and spitting out the drive lines. And you know, it seems like a stopgap measure to me, but at the same time, that's the way they decided to fix that. Now, the silicone we use won't do that because it's much, much softer. And if you have to limit how far your shock will compress, then you're going to need something a little heavier than that. Part two, as far as that goes, is we use it in the tops. So this is the mounting point, and we use it in all kinds of the RCs because at the same time, just like in the bottom, when you hit, have you ever noticed that when you hit good and hard, you bend the shock tower connection points, the standoffs and stuff, you bend those bolts? The problem with that is when you hit good and hard and there's no way to give. In other words, if you take this one, it's got a hard mount at the bottom and the top. It's a hard mount, so there's no give in those at all. There's a ball here and there's a ball there, and it's solid. And once you compress it, it is basically a solid rod in there. So it's solid. There's nowhere else for it to give. It has to give on the top or the bottom. Those are the connection points. So that's where your give's going to be. If you, keep in mind, this is geared towards bashing hard. That's what we do with these here. We're into bashing. And so we jump over stuff, we land hard, we cartwheel, we tumble. And the more we do that, the more we've learned of the necessity to put this in there. Is it cosmetically beautiful? No, it's not, but it's functional. And the idea of this is when you actually hit the bottom and you bottom this out, there's still some cushion at the bolt. And once we started doing this, we've had a lot better luck with our standoffs, our suspensions. Everything holds a little better because this actually absorbs a bit more of the impact before it transfers all that energy into the hard components that it's attached to. The shock tower, the standoffs, the arms, the hinge pins, everything that's connected to that feels the impact. But if you can put something in there that's soft, that will absorb some of that, this will allow, here, let me grab this for you and show you what I mean. So we'll grab this, and this will go, and this is just a regular driver. But when you put this through, and this one fits, and it's nice and snug, so it's nice and snug on there. But look how this allows movement, right? So you can move it any way you want to, and when you put pressure against it, the rubber deforms a little bit and takes the impact, and it doesn't have that sharp grab that you get when you hit the max on your shock. This helps soften the blow, and that's the whole thing. So the more you can soften the blow, the longer your equipment lasts. The longer your equipment lasts, the more fun you can have with it. And so that's why we do it. Is it the only way to do things? No. Is it the right way to do things? If you believe the engineers know everything there is to know about the RCs they build, then buy all the stock parts. That's fine. But I've been in the engineering field with a friend of mine for a long time building mechanical device. And I've done a lot of different things, but one thing I was raised to do was understand physics and how it works. And I'm not a genius by any stretch of the imagination, but I understand the basics of it. And so if you think the engineers know everything, they don't. They don't know everything. That's why you get upgrades in different vehicles, because they learn as they go. The thing about it is, when you have two hard mounts there's no room for give. Now, this is still tight enough in there to where it's still a solid thing. It doesn't rattle around in there, so you'll still have the control you're looking for. It won't flop because that fits in there just right, and the bolt's nice and snug through it. So it still gives you that finite control, but there's give when you need it. And that's the important part. And the third part, it's ride height. So it depends on what you're doing with your RC, but you should know the options are out there. You don't have to just buy shorter shocks. If you need, if your car takes this set of shocks, you can adjust them depending on the ride height you're looking for. And the way to do that is spelled out in RC Shocks 101. But the idea here is simply this. If you're going to, let's say you want to do speed runs with your Creighton. You want to set the weight as close to the ground as you can and get some light tires on there. That's where it's going to really come into shine. That's the beauty of the Italian tires over the Creighton tires, because they have a lighter amount of mass. They won't want to stand up as easily, and you'll get those speed runs a lot better. That's why the Italian is rated at 70 miles an hour and the Creighton isn't out of the box. So when you want to get your ride height down, there's two ways you can do it. You can use the grub screws and it'll lower the vehicle. However, if the grub screws don't get you where you want to be, you still have a good stop at the bottom of that. But if the grub screws don't get you where you want to be, you can put a piece of silicone on the inside to limit how far out this will go. So the beauty of that is simply this. When you put a shock on there that is maxed out, in other words, this one, okay, when you put this shock on there, there's no more. You can't pull it out. It's maxed. That's as far out as it goes. And that's fine. But usually you don't use 100% of your suspension. You don't. When you set your suspension ride height and you're using the grub screws, you're compressing your shocks a little bit to get that ride height you want. So you're not using the whole thing anyway. With this, you still have give the other way too. So if you hit something and it pulls out on the arm, this will absorb the impact going the other way as well, because it'll compress the silicone that's on the inside to some degree. It won't compress the way it will on the outside, but it will compress to some degree, and it'll take some of that sharp impact out of it when you're tumbling and cartwheeling. The idea is if you need to shorten your shock absorber to get your car down close to the ground, and you figure it out, what you do is you put this on your car, and it's sitting there, and you get a good look at where it's at. Take the spring off first so it's just the shock. Push the car down where you want it, mark it, put a little clamp on there or something just so you can see where it goes, then take it off the car and stretch it all the way out. And that will tell you how long a piece of rubber you'll need to get the ride height you're looking for. Be sure to cut 4 pieces exactly the same length, or you'll get a little more pressure on one side than the other. So when you cut these to put them on the inside, let's say you only want to lower your car 1/4 of an inch. Well, that might take 3/8 or 1/2 inch of silicone here. Because of the way they sit on the car, it may take a little more in here. You can't measure from the chassis to the ground, put that in here and get that because of the geometry of these. So what it comes down to is put this on the car, push the car down where you want it, mark it. Take this off and stretch it. That'll show you how much silicone you'll need on the inside. And when you put that all together and do it in all 4 and put them back on the car, it'll inherently sit right where you wanted it, because you can adjust the ride height from here. Now let's say you're running 70, 80 miles an hour with your car and it gets out of pocket. Down the road it goes. It starts to cartwheel. With it done this way and not against the grub screws, because the grub screws are solid, they're attached, they hit the chassis, there's nowhere for the arm to go, right? Because it's up against the grub screw. Now any impact down on that is going to put extra pressure on the arms. Doing it this way, you have that extra. So when it hits, it'll allow it to compress the silicone some, be easier on the arms, and you'll still maintain that ride height. That's why we use the silicone. Well, I hope this video was helpful and it elaborated on what we touched on in the first one. We really enjoy doing these kind of things because there's more to it than meets the eye. Every one of these is a machine, and yes, they're toys. But at the same time, they're machines, and there's a lot you can do with a machine. If you have a creative mind, you can come up with really cool stuff. If you watch any of the platforms out there, you've seen people do amazing things with these cars. And it's stuff they just dream up and do, and you can do it too. It's not that hard once you apply yourself to it and figure ways to pull it off. If you haven't already, don't forget to bash that like button and help our content spread. We love doing these kind of things, and don't forget our membership is open now, so you can get to the link in the description down below and join us here at the channel. If you join us here at the channel, it helps us keep creating content that's helpful to our community. If you have anything you'd like to add to this video, please feel free to get in the comments down below and help others along the way. For AJ Jam Studios, I'm AJ saying, keep wrenching.